welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a filmmaker who is here to discuss an absolutely beautiful documentary that I watched this past weekend and have been thinking about ever since. So thank you for coming. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your film, please?
Sure thing, Jen. My name is Ron Small, and the film is Mark, A Call to Action.
It is so beautiful. And I'm wondering if we could start out with you talking a little bit about your career and your journey to this film.
Well, it's kind of funny because now you've seen it, and of course we're saying this to people who haven't seen it. One of the major players in the program is a man named Paul Bookman. He's a dentist in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. And although we are both in our sixth decade, we actually met day one of college in August of 1978. It's hard to believe. He lived on the other side of the bathroom from my dorm. And he said to me one day, he said, "What are you majoring in?" And I said, "I don't know. I was going to be a pre-med. That was my whole focus. All I wanted to be was a doctor." And he was a pre-dent. And he goes, "I'm majoring in anthropology because it's similar to the sciences. It's more interesting, whatever." And I said, I'd taken so much advanced science in high school. I wanted to do something different. So I did that. But I realized in short order, I was not going to be a doctor, whether it was my grades or living in a 24-hour town in New Orleans and having access to all that. And my father, who owned a successful medical manufacturing business at the time, called me up one day and he said, this was before caller ID. "Hello, yeah, this is your father. Just letting you know we're hiring a lot of anthropologists in the office this year. Okay, bye." Click. His way of saying you might want to rethink your aspirations. And I always had the creative business in the back of my mind. But my parents, "Oh, no, you be a doctor. That's for people in Los Angeles." And not wanting to belabor the point. So I think I was a sophomore at the time at Tulane University in New Orleans, and there was a phenol spill in the Mississippi River. A barge broke open and this carcinogenic liquid pours into the river. And that's where the drinking water comes from. And the newscaster said, "Don't drink your water for the next 3 days." So this is ridiculous. How can we not drink the water? And I came up with this novelty item. It was a jar of actual dirty water called Authentic Nolans Mississippi River Water. And on the back, it said, ingredients: hydrogen, oxygen, petroleum, chloroform, phenol, nuclear waste, things that actually found in the water, and suggested uses: powering your car, removing paint, cultivating tumors, killing weeds. And the school newspaper took a picture of me with my prepubescent face and holding up this jar of water. And the next thing you know, I am on pages 1 and 2 of newspapers all over the country. It was on the AP Newswire, if you remember that. And I thought, oh man, if I can get this kind of publicity from this stupid jar of dirty water, I need to go into the media business. And that's how it started. So
That's a great origin story. That's a wonderful path. So how did you come to this project? Could you talk a little bit about meeting Dr. Mark Bookman and how the film originated?
Sure. Again, for folks who haven't seen this yet, this is a topic that became so near and dear to my heart, basically the rights of the disabled. And in my world of production, I started in commercials and I did a lot of corporate video, which paid the bills for a long time. I did voiceovers and I still do. And documentaries was always my love, telling the story and typically sitting down with people who've never been in front of a camera. And Paul and I did not speak for no reason other than we both went in different directions over time, and we reconnected years later, and it was like no time had passed. When you have a best friend, it always works out that way. But I didn't know about what happened, as people will see in the documentary. I don't know how detailed you want to get, but the last time I saw Mark and his sister Rachel was when Mark was about 5 and Rachel was about 3, but Mark had been born prematurely. And in the program, we show that he was born 16 weeks prematurely. He weighed 1 pound, 10 and a half ounces. And he survived and thrived and came out of that environment unbelievably healthy and ready for his life. And I didn't know about all the other stuff that you'll see when you watch the program. So when Paul and I reconnected about maybe 4 years ago, he told me everything you see in the documentary. After an hour, and it was my turn to tell my story. My kids are great, my wife is great. I said, Paul, I have to digest what you just told me. I just can't talk at this point. It was that breathtaking. And a week went by before it was my turn. But even then, the story did not hit me like a sledgehammer. Idiot, this is the greatest documentary ever. How could you not see what's happening? And Paul posted a picture of Mark in a wheelchair, sort of a 3/4 inch perspective, and he looked regal. And we always joke he had what's called the Bookman smirk, because he was smarter than everybody else, and he really was. And I looked at that picture and I go, oh my God, I can't believe. Paul, we got to do this documentary. What do you think? And at the time, Mark was living full-time in Tokyo. He had a PhD from University of Pennsylvania. He spoke fluent Japanese. And Paul said, well, let's get him on a Zoom and find out. And that began the process, which then every Thursday morning for him, Wednesday night for me, for a year, Mark and I got on a Zoom call for at least an hour and just talked about what the show should look like, what has to be in there, what can we do without, that kind of a thing. And it was a great opportunity to get to know Mark, who, again, I hadn't seen since he was a kid. And now he was this incredibly brilliant scholar, advocate for the disabled in a way that I don't think has ever been seen before. And we didn't know what a global influence he was until we were really getting into the program. And it's been a fascinating journey, I have to tell you.
Yeah, he really was a remarkable figure and lived an extraordinary life. And he comes across as you say, brilliant and very funny. He's very, very funny in the documentary as well. Could you talk a little bit about how you chose to structure the documentary, perhaps, because it follows sort of the narrative of a life, but it's also broken up by these really beautiful manga-like or anime-like illustrations. Could you talk a little bit about how you chose to structure it and working with artists in order to give it that shape?
Well, I guess I'm going to give away some of what you'll see in the documentary, but the original version is not the version that you now saw. Originally, it was going to be me and Mark working together, taking our time and accessing funding from the various foundations that he worked with. He was a global authority on diversity and disability access and inclusion. I mean, just an incredible guy. And, again, I'm not going to hold back on the story. He passed away 6 weeks after we shot his interviews. Now, Paul approached me and he was distraught. He goes, does this mean that the documentary is a waste? I said, no. On the contrary, it's now become exponentially more important and we need to get this done sooner than later. We can't sit on this part of the story. And nobody expected it. It was a terrible shock. And so then it became, okay, it's really about Mark's work and what he touched along the way. But we had to tell the story as best we could of the whole disability world. So we included lots of other disabilities within the program, people who were, dealing with it themselves or had a family member, and then lots of talk about the disability movement, the ADA, the independent living movement, what have you. So we feel like we did a nice cross section of the disability world. And even though Mark's interview started in the 1400s in Japan, we politely left a lot of that stuff out. But if you look at the US, for example, the independent living movement in the 70s and leading into the ADA and all that stuff. But Japan and the US, which is why Mark was in Japan, are very much in sync. The US learns a lot from what has happened in Japan, but the big difference, as Mark and others point out, is that in the US, it's a civil right. So the government is required to do certain things. In Japan, it's not a civil right, but they do it anyway because it needs to be done for those who are disabled and must have access to full-time care or whatever. But there's a slippery slope there in terms of what's right and what really needs to be improved upon. And Mark knew what was happening in Japan. He fell in love with Japan through anime and manga, as we discuss in the program. And the illustrations that you see in the documentary were done by a brilliant artist named John Byer, who happens to live in New Orleans, also where our genius of an editor, David Jones, lives, and he and I worked on this thing for, I mean, it's over 2 years in the making, but there's a lot of artistry. Just to throw this out, everybody who got involved with this project knew it was a labor of love, and they were absolutely devoted to bring their A game, because we were touching on something that was so necessary and so special. So I'm very proud of the team that came together to make this show. And I trust when you see it, you can't watch it without a box of Kleenex. It's really an emotional roller coaster. And to sit back, you really, honestly, can never complain when you see how some of these people live and what challenges they have on a daily basis. It's hard to complain about anything when you say, well, it could always be worse. But Mark, in his brilliance, always saw the glass as half full. He always understood that he had lots of privileges in spite of his disability and the challenges that he had. And I did ask him one day before I met him in person, I said, you get a lot of accolades. You're really kind of a rock star. Would you trade that to be out of the chair? And he said, no. He very quickly said, I know I was put on this earth for a purpose. And no, I would not. And it took my breath away, honestly. I mean, who lives like this? And as brilliant as he was and as challenged as he really was on this planet to make life better for other people. He truly did that in his daily life. And it's hard to imagine being in the company of somebody like that.
Yeah, the range of people who you talk to over the course of this documentary, family and friends and coworkers, and then other people in the disability community and other advocates, it really paints a remarkable portrait of this person. And it seems like everybody was really thrilled to just come and speak of all of his accomplishments and his personality and the relationships. I would love if you could talk a little bit about his life and how that, as well as like the history of the disability movement, kind of structure the project. He was so active and he did do so much, and there's so much material. Did that make the job of editing it into a story harder or easier? Is it harder to work with more or with less?
That's a great question. Under the circumstances, because Mark left us before the editing process, it is a much different film. And I think, if anything, it might have been a little easier because Mark and I are both pretty headstrong people, and we would have probably been battling over what direction the show should be. He was more of an academic, and I'm looking at it as, we need to make this for the consumers. We need to say, this is for the world, not just for the professors in universities. And ultimately, it was an embarrassment of riches. We had so much material to work with. And the way I edit a program is I personally log every interview. Even though I'm the one that asked the questions and I'm listening for those answers, I go through every interview. I write down or type in points and out points with time code, if you're familiar with that. And I pick sometimes words, sentences, phrases, and each of them are put into a folder with a particular topic, like early life or premature birth. I mean, name it. And ultimately, I think we had maybe 60 or 70 of these folders, and not all of them were going to make it into the program. And it's like putting a puzzle together. So we had so much material. Originally, this was going to be a 1-hour show, and it came out ultimately at almost 90 minutes because it would have been like cutting off the baby's arms. What could we take out to make it shorter? Because at one point we were going to do this with PBS and then opted to go in a different direction because we were looking at a longer program and felt that we could really get the impact going through digital and streaming and cable and everything else that we're doing. And by the way, the official release date, global release date, is October 8th. And you can pre-order the DVD for those who still get DVDs on Amazon. You can go to Amazon right now and find it. So ultimately, it wasn't that it was easier or harder. It's a laborious task. If you've ever been in an edit suite, I mean, sometimes we'll spend an hour on 5 seconds of footage just manipulating it properly. So unless you have a stomach for that, it's hard to sit in an edit suite and watch people work. And I am not the guy who presses the buttons and does all the finesse and that's David. I'm the guy who said, well, let's try this, let's try that. And he knows what to do and how to manipulate things. And a lot of it is, let's watch it, see it, let's take that off, let's shave that, let's put a music piece, whatever. And so really a lot of the creativity happens in the edit suite. And that's the luxury of digital technology, is the ability to use a mouse and move things around, as opposed to the old days where you had to put things on a timeline in real time. Well, let's do that again. Well, that means watching the 7-minute clip and then the 10-minute clip. No, I don't like that. Let's turn it around again. So it changes the world of creative editing, and it's extraordinary to watch it come together. Because typically at the beginning you're going, I don't know if we have anything here, and then as we move on, we say, wow, this is really special. I think we've really come up with something wonderful. And I've probably watched the show 500 times at this point. And I have a dear friend in the industry named Clark Santee, who for 50 years directed every musical show for PBS. I mean, an incredible history. And he has a great line. He said, "You never finish a show, you abandon it." And it's true. You could spend the rest of your life tweaking it and playing with it, and it's not going to make it any better. You just have to finally say, okay, it's done. Let's get it out there and see what kind of response we get.
Yeah, that is a really good skill, I think, is knowing when to end, because I think I am also very inclined to be a person who can tinker forever, and never really be done with something. So that is like a big thing.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming to talk about this project. It really is, it's fascinating and it's very moving. And I think it's going to accomplish a lot in changing how people think about disability and the disability movement. I think one of the most touching things that gets said over the course of the whole show is when he mentions that everyone will be disabled someday. So this really does apply to everyone eventually. And I think that's very powerful.
What Mark was a genius, well, of many things he was a genius, but he equated disability with aging. So what he's really done, which is a gift to all of us, is made this a program that has a global demographic. There isn't anyone out there that won't be touched by either birth with a disability or, God forbid, having an accident and becoming disabled, which can happen. Or if you get old enough, you're going to need a wheelchair or a walker, or you might lose your eyesight. So there really is a message and a lesson in here for everybody. And you can't just walk around clucking your tongue at somebody who's got a disability and think, oh, there but for the grace of God. Well, guess what? You're going to be there at some point also. So it becomes, for the first time in my career, a program that literally touches every demographic out there. And a lot of people won't pay attention to it. But if you're like everyone else who's seen it already, now you'll be aware whenever you go somewhere, you're going to look for things like curb cuts and access. And are we really taking care of those who need this type of, accessibility? And it's not anything that doesn't, as is mentioned in the documentary, become part of the fabric of the community. You don't even notice it anymore. You might use a ramp for yourself, even though it was put there for somebody who might be in a walker or a wheelchair, but it becomes part of the environment. It's not a big deal. And we have a gentleman named Victor Dover who has a company in Miami that designs urban areas and makes them more accessible and more pleasing to the eye as well. And his point is, and it's true, do this in the beginning. Think about these lessons as you're building. Don't wait till afterwards when, as he says, you try to fix things with patches and Band-Aids. It doesn't work the same. And that really is true as well. It's really a matter of priorities. And many of these disabled people will tell you, I don't want anything special. I just want to be treated like everybody else. Don't look at me like I'm different. Don't look at me like there's something wrong with me. We all should have a seat at the table. And that was Mark's big thing is, and really disability community uses this mantra a lot. Nothing about us without us, which makes perfect sense. If you're not disabled, who are you to say how something should be done? You really do need to bring in people from all areas and let them put in their 2 cents about how to make things better. So again, from a positive standpoint, you'll walk away from this program feeling very uplifted, but also I think motivated to do things in your own community. But if you do nothing else but look around where you are, and even getting into a store, Paul and Mark told the story once. Paul went to visit Mark in Japan, and this was some years ago, and Mark made a big impact in Japan. In fact, was going to become the head of this global organization based in Japan had he not passed away. He was ready for that job, and he spoke fluent Japanese, by the way. But they talk about a day they were hungry, and it was kind of a rainy, cold day. And they were walking down this major street, Mark in his wheelchair, Paul walking next to him. And I don't remember the number, but it was like 53 restaurants were inaccessible to Mark's wheelchair, where it might have been a simple ramp. You know, it could have been that easy for somebody to make it inclusive, and that was not to be. And that was a big thing. You know, so Mark, of course, added that to his list of things that he dealt with, and he did this on a regular basis. Karen Nakamura, who's a professor from UC Berkeley in the program, likes to mention wherever Mark went, the world became a better place. And it really was true. He just had this knack and this ability to never take no prisoners. I mean, he was a force. So it was amazing to be in his presence, I have to say. And a little aside about Mark, I told you earlier that he fell in love with Japan because of anime and manga. That was his thing. And you'll see that in the documentary. But he really became very Japanese in a way. As an example, when we were putting together the interview schedule, you know, I'm bringing in my American production attitude and what have you. And so he had this whole schedule put together, so-and-so at this time, so-and-so at that time. And I would very matter-of-factly say, well, let's just move him to Wednesday. And oh, no, we can't do that, because he would have lost face. You've heard that before. If he asked somebody to change their schedule, even though it would make things much easier for us. But okay, I get it. We don't want to upset the apple cart, ruin your life over there. We'll do as you say, and we'll stick to the way it was. And it all worked out beautifully.
Wow. Yeah, what a remarkable portrait of a life and a personality and a movement. It's really very lovely. And I'm very thankful that you came to discuss it with us. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I love talking about it. It's a very personal project. It was my first and second trip to Japan. I was supposed to go the third time for our world premiere in Tokyo and got COVID right beforehand. Couldn't make it, but we had a great team over there and had a very successful world premiere. We had promised Mark a Tokyo premiere, and we had two at different campuses of the University of Tokyo and one at Sophia University. And then the U.S., we had a premiere. Our U.S. premiere was in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania at the Bryn Mawr Film Institute. Full house, unbelievable response, very, very rewarding. And unfortunately, Mark was not there, but I'm sure he was watching, because there are a lot of things that happen that we know that's Mark's influence. His father has told me too many stories about things that have happened to him that are absolutely Mark's influence. And it's hard to not take that seriously.
Yeah, that's really lovely. Thank you again. This is so wonderful. And I'm very excited for our patrons to view this. Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure. This was great fun. And as I mentioned, usually it's me interviewing, so it's really different to be on the receiving end. But hey, obviously you do a great job, and I love your podcast. It's a huge success. So kudos for the hard work and effort you put into it.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful to hear. I appreciate that.
Sure.
All right, patrons, it is now your turn. Please check out Mark, A Call to Action. It is a very moving, fascinating, and really it will change your perspective. All right, thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.